Saul of Tarsus was once the church's most feared persecutor. Armed with authority from the religious leaders in Jerusalem, he set out for Damascus determined to arrest followers of Jesus. But everything changed on the road. A blinding light stopped him in his tracks. He encountered the risen Christ, lost his sight, and after being healed, was baptized as a follower of Jesus. The man who left Jerusalem to destroy Christianity entered a new life as one of its believers. The man who came to Damascus to destroy Christianity had disappeared. In his place stood someone no one could explain. Saul of Tarsus, the feared persecutor of the church, had become a follower of Jesus. Across Damascus, the news spread rapidly, leaving both believers and religious leaders in disbelief. Saul's reputation was known throughout the region. Stories of arrests, imprisonments, and persecution followed him wherever his name was mentioned. He was the last person anyone expected to join the movement he had worked so hard to destroy. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The man who entered Damascus determined to arrest Christians had emerged as one of them. His baptism marked the beginning of a completely new life. After spending several days with the disciples in Damascus, Saul did something that astonished everyone around him. He started preaching. The change was immediate. There was no lengthy period of hesitation, no attempt to quietly disappear from public view. The same passion that had once fueled his opposition to Jesus was now driving him to proclaim Jesus. He entered synagogues and boldly declared a message that would have shocked his listeners. Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God. The statement was revolutionary. Many who heard him could scarcely believe their ears. They knew who Saul was. They knew why he had come to Damascus. They expected him to oppose the followers of Jesus, not join them. Again and again, people asked the same question. Isn't this the man who came here to destroy those who call on this name? Their confusion was understandable. Only days earlier, Saul had viewed Jesus as a false Messiah. Now he proclaimed him as Lord. Only days earlier, he sought authority to imprison believers. Now he stood among them as a brother. The transformation was so dramatic that many struggled to comprehend it. Yet Saul's conviction only grew stronger. His years of studying the scriptures suddenly took on new meaning. Passages he had memorized as a Pharisee now appeared in a different light. He began connecting the promises of the Old Testament with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The prophets, the Psalms, the promises given to Israel. Everything pointed toward Christ. The knowledge that once equipped him to oppose the gospel now equipped him to defend it. As Saul preached, he demonstrated remarkable skill in explaining why Jesus fulfilled the messianic prophecies. His arguments were powerful. His understanding of Scripture was extensive. Those who debated him often found themselves unable to answer his reasoning. The more he spoke, the more opposition grew. Not everyone welcomed his message. The same religious circles that once admired Saul now viewed him with suspicion. Some considered him a traitor. Others saw him as a dangerous threat. The man who had once fought on their side had become one of their strongest opponents. Hostility increased. What began as disbelief gradually turned into anger. The situation became so serious that Saul's life was placed in danger. Plans were made to eliminate him. The irony could not have been greater. Not long before, Saul had pursued followers of Jesus. Now others were pursuing him. The hunter had become the hunted. The persecutor had become the persecuted. For the first time, Saul personally experienced the cost of following Christ. The path ahead would not be easy. Jesus had never promised comfort. He had promised a mission, and that mission would require sacrifice. Yet despite the growing danger, Saul did not retreat. His encounter with the risen Christ had changed him too deeply. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had heard. No threat could erase the reality of that experience. The man who once believed he was serving God by opposing Jesus now understood that true service meant following him completely. Eventually, the threat against Saul became impossible to ignore. Opponents watched the city gates day and night, waiting for an opportunity to kill him. Escape seemed impossible, but the believers in Damascus devised a plan. Under cover of darkness, they lowered Saul in a large basket through an opening in the city wall. The image is unforgettable. The proud Pharisee who once traveled with official authority now fled for his life in a basket. The man who once commanded fear now depended entirely on the courage and kindness of fellow believers. God was teaching him an important lesson. The kingdom he would help build would not be established through power, influence, or force. It would advance through faith, humility, and obedience. The escape marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Saul's conversion was no longer merely a private experience. The world had begun to notice. Friends became enemies. Enemies became brothers. Old ambitions faded. A new purpose emerged. The journey ahead would take him across the Roman Empire. He would stand before governors, philosophers, kings, and ordinary citizens. He would preach in synagogues, marketplaces, prisons, and public squares. But before any of that could happen, Saul faced another challenge. The believers in Jerusalem still remembered his past. Many feared him. Many doubted his transformation. And when Saul finally returned to the city he had once used as the center of his campaign against the church, he would discover that earning trust would not be easy. The man who had become a follower of Jesus now needed the followers of Jesus to believe that his transformation was real. The basket disappeared into the darkness. Slowly, carefully, Saul was lowered through an opening in the city wall of Damascus. Below him stretched uncertainty. Behind him remained a city where powerful enemies sought his death. The escape was humiliating by worldly standards. Years earlier, Saul had traveled with confidence and authority. Religious leaders respected him. His future seemed bright. He had influence, status, and a clear path forward. Now he fled under cover of night like a wanted man. Yet what appeared to be a setback was actually preparation. God was reshaping the man who would one day carry the gospel across the Roman Empire. The lessons had already begun. Pride was giving way to humility. Self-confidence was being replaced by dependence upon God. The persecutor who once relied on his own strength was learning to trust divine guidance. After leaving Damascus, Saul spent a period of time away from public attention. The scriptures provide only brief details about this stage of his life, but it was undoubtedly significant. For years he had studied the law. Now he had to rethink everything in light of Christ. The promises made to Abraham, the covenant with Israel, the sacrifices, the prophets, the Messiah, all of it pointed toward Jesus. The process must have been both exciting and overwhelming. The scriptures Saul knew so well were opening before him in ways he had never imagined. The pieces were finally coming together. What once seemed confusing now appeared clear. The crucifixion was not a defeat, it was part of God's plan. The resurrection was not a myth, it was the foundation of the gospel. The Messiah had come, and his kingdom was advancing. Eventually, Saul made his way to Jerusalem. Returning to the city was no simple matter. Jerusalem held painful memories. It was there that he had approved of Stephen's execution. It was there that many believers had suffered because of his actions. It was there that his reputation as a persecutor had been established. Now he arrived not as an enemy of the church, but as a follower of Christ. Yet convincing others of that fact proved difficult. The believers in Jerusalem were afraid. Their fears were understandable. They remembered Saul. They remembered the arrests. They remembered the threats. They remembered the suffering. When word spread that Saul wanted to join the disciples, many refused to believe his conversion was genuine. Some suspected a trap. Others feared deception. What if Saul was pretending? What if this was merely another strategy to identify believers? The trust he hoped to receive was not easily granted. For the first time, Saul experienced the consequences of his former actions from a different perspective. The fear he had once inspired now stood between him and the community he wished to join. Then an important figure stepped forward. His name was Barnabas. Barnabas had already earned a reputation as a man of encouragement and faith. Where others saw reasons for doubt, Barnabas often saw possibilities. He listened to Saul's story. He heard about the road to Damascus. He learned of the encounter with the risen Christ. He saw evidence of genuine transformation, and he believed him. Barnabas took Saul to the apostles and personally vouched for him. He explained how Saul had seen the Lord. He described how boldly Saul had preached in Damascus. He testified that the former persecutor had truly become a disciple. The support of Barnabas changed everything. Gradually, the barriers began to fall. The apostles welcomed Saul. The church that once feared him began accepting him as a brother. It was a remarkable display of grace. The believers had every reason to hold on to suspicion and resentment. Instead, they chose forgiveness. The man who had caused so much pain was embraced by the very people he had once tried to destroy. Saul soon began speaking boldly in Jerusalem. His courage remained unchanged. Only the direction of his zeal had changed. He preached openly about Jesus. He defended the gospel. He engaged in debates and discussions. Once again, opposition followed. The message that transformed Saul continued to provoke strong reactions. Among those who resisted him were members of groups known as the Hellenistic Jews. Ironically, these were some of the same circles that had once opposed Stephen. The pattern repeated itself. Arguments intensified, hostility increased, and before long another plot emerged. This time, Saul was the target. The man who had once approved of violence against believers now found himself facing the same danger. His life was once again at risk. The church acted quickly. Recognizing the seriousness of the threat, believers escorted Saul away from Jerusalem. He traveled to Caesarea and from there returned to his hometown of Tarsus. For many observers, it may have seemed like a retreat, yet God was still preparing his servant. The public ministry that would one day influence nations had not fully begun. There were still lessons to learn, still experiences to gain, still doors waiting to open. Meanwhile, the church entered a period of relative peace. Throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, believers continued growing in faith. The gospel spread steadily, and far away in Tarsus, Saul waited. He could not yet see the full scope of God's plan. He did not know the cities he would visit. He did not know the churches he would establish. He did not know the letters he would write. He did not know that generations of believers would one day study his words. But God knew. The former persecutor was being prepared for a mission far greater than anything he could imagine. And soon, a man named Barnabas would return with an invitation that would change the course of Saul's life once again. The real mission was about to begin. Years passed, but God's work in Saul's life was far from complete. Hidden from the public eye, the former persecutor was being prepared for a mission that would carry the gospel across the Roman world. The dramatic events on the road to Damascus had transformed Saul's life. But the full scope of his calling had not yet been revealed. He had preached boldly. He had faced opposition. He had escaped multiple threats against his life. Now he waited. Far from the major centers of Christian activity, Saul lived in Tarsus, his hometown. The years were not wasted. Though Scripture provides only limited details about this period, they became a season of quiet growth, reflection, and preparation for the work that lay ahead. The former Pharisee was learning to wait upon God's timing. The man who once rushed headlong into every mission was discovering that God's timing often differs from human expectations. Meanwhile, the church continued to grow. What began in Jerusalem had spread throughout Judea and Samaria. Believers carried the message of Jesus into new regions, and one city in particular became increasingly important: Antioch. Located in Syria, Antioch was one of the largest and most influential cities in the Roman Empire. It was a center of trade, culture, and diversity. People from many nations lived within its walls. Languages, customs, and beliefs from across the empire converged there. As the gospel reached Antioch, something remarkable happened. Large numbers of non-Jews began embracing the message of Jesus. Until this point, many believers still viewed Christianity primarily through a Jewish lens. Yet in Antioch, the church was becoming increasingly diverse. Gentiles were coming to faith in significant numbers. The development attracted attention. When reports reached Jerusalem, church leaders decided to send Barnabas to investigate. It was an excellent choice. Barnabas possessed wisdom, compassion, and spiritual maturity. Unlike many others, he recognized God's work even when it appeared in unexpected ways. When he arrived in Antioch, he witnessed something extraordinary. The grace of God was evident everywhere. People from different backgrounds worshiped together. The gospel was transforming lives. The church was flourishing. Rather than attempting to restrict the movement, Barnabas encouraged it. He urged believers to remain faithful to the Lord with all their hearts. The results were immediate. Even more people joined the church. The growing congregation needed leadership. It needed teachers. It needed men capable of explaining the scriptures and strengthening believers in their faith. Barnabas knew exactly who could help. His thoughts turned to Saul. Years earlier, he had been the one who welcomed Saul when others feared him. He had seen the evidence of God's work in the former persecutor's life. Now he believed the time had come for Saul's next assignment. Leaving Antioch, Barnabas traveled to Tarsus in search of him. Imagine the moment. Saul had spent years preparing, learning, and waiting. He could not have known that the invitation he was about to receive would launch one of the most influential ministries in Christian history. When Barnabas found him, he brought him back to Antioch. Together, the two men began teaching the growing congregation. For an entire year, they worked among the believers. They taught the scriptures. They strengthened disciples. They helped establish a strong foundation for the church. The impact was profound. Antioch soon became one of the most important centers of early Christianity. It was there that followers of Jesus were first called Christians. What may have begun as a label used by outsiders eventually became one of the most recognized identities in human history. Yet God had an even greater purpose in mind. As the leaders of the church worshiped and prayed together, the Holy Spirit spoke. The message was clear. Barnabas and Saul were to be set apart for a special work. A new mission was beginning. This was no ordinary assignment. The gospel had spread through believers fleeing persecution. Now the church would intentionally send missionaries into the wider world. After fasting and praying, the believers laid their hands upon Barnabas and Saul and sent them out. The moment marked a turning point. The mission of the church was expanding beyond familiar boundaries. The message of Jesus would now move systematically into new territories, cities, and cultures. Barnabas and Saul traveled first to Cyprus. There they preached in synagogues and shared the gospel with Jewish communities across the island. As always, opposition emerged, but so did opportunities. One of the most dramatic moments occurred when they encountered a magician and false prophet named Elymas. The man attempted to oppose their message and prevent others from hearing the truth. For Saul, this became a defining moment. Filled with the Holy Spirit, he confronted the deception directly. The authority and confidence displayed during the encounter astonished those who witnessed it. Even more significant was what happened next. From this point forward, the book of Acts begins referring to Saul by his Roman name, Paul. The name change reflected the expanding nature of his mission. He was no longer simply ministering within Jewish circles. He was becoming an apostle to the Gentile world. The former Pharisee from Jerusalem was stepping onto the stage of world history. The man who once traveled to destroy the church was now traveling to build it. City by city, region by region, soul by soul, the mission had begun. Yet the road ahead would be far more difficult than Paul imagined. Persecution, imprisonment, rejection, and suffering awaited him. But so did miracles, conversions, churches, and opportunities to proclaim Christ before people who had never heard his name. The journey that began on a dusty road near Damascus was now carrying Paul toward the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire. and the world would never be the same. The mission was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a movement. Paul and Barnabas had been sent out by the church in Antioch with a clear purpose: carry the message of Jesus to places where it had never been heard. The gospel was no longer confined to Jerusalem, Judea, or even Syria. It was moving outward into the vast territories of the Roman Empire. The task was enormous. The Roman world stretched across thousands of miles, connecting diverse cultures, languages, and traditions. Great cities flourished along trade routes. Merchants traveled constantly. Ideas spread rapidly. Yet despite its sophistication, the empire was filled with spiritual confusion. People worshipped countless gods. Temples dominated city skylines. Sacrifices were offered daily. Superstition and philosophy competed for influence. Into this world stepped Paul. His message was simple. There was one true God. Jesus Christ had died and risen again. Salvation was available to all who believed. The message challenged everything many people thought they knew. As Paul traveled from city to city, he followed a consistent pattern. Whenever possible, he entered the local synagogue first. There he spoke with Jews and God-fearing Gentiles who already knew the scriptures. Using the law and the prophets, he demonstrated that Jesus fulfilled the promises of the Old Testament. Some listened, some believed, others rejected him. Every city produced different reactions, but wherever Paul went, one thing remained constant. People responded. The gospel demanded a decision. One of the most significant stops on the journey was Pisidian Antioch. Standing before a gathered crowd, Paul delivered a powerful sermon tracing God's work throughout Israel's history. He explained how Jesus fulfilled the hopes and promises given to the Jewish people. Many listeners were deeply moved. They invited him to speak again. Word spread quickly. By the following Sabbath, nearly the entire city seemed eager to hear the message. The overwhelming response created tension. Religious leaders who opposed Paul's teaching became jealous of the growing crowds. Arguments erupted. Opposition intensified. Paul responded with remarkable boldness. Since many had rejected the message, he declared that he would now focus increasingly on the Gentiles. It was a pivotal moment. The mission was expanding beyond traditional boundaries. The gospel was proving to be a message for all nations. As Paul continued traveling, he witnessed extraordinary transformations. In city after city, lives changed. Families embraced the faith. Communities of believers formed. Churches emerged where none had existed before. Yet success brought danger. Opponents followed him from place to place. Rumors spread. Crowds were stirred against him. The same man who once persecuted Christians was now being persecuted because of Christ. One dramatic incident occurred in Lystra. There, Paul encountered a man who had been unable to walk since birth. The man listened intently as Paul preached. Seeing his faith, Paul commanded him to stand. Immediately, the man jumped to his feet and began walking. The miracle astonished everyone present. The crowd could hardly believe what they had witnessed. In their excitement, they reached a shocking conclusion. They believed the gods had come down among them in human form. Barnabas was identified with Zeus. Paul was identified with Hermes because he did most of the speaking. Soon priests arrived with animals prepared for sacrifice. The crowd wanted to worship them. The situation revealed how deeply spiritual confusion dominated many parts of the Roman world. Paul and Barnabas were horrified. Tearing their clothes, they rushed into the crowd. They pleaded with the people to stop. "We are only human beings like you." They explained that the miracle pointed not to themselves, but to the living God who created heaven and earth. For a moment, the crowd listened, but public opinion can change quickly. Enemies soon arrived from neighboring cities. The same crowd that wanted to worship Paul was persuaded to turn against him. Violence erupted. Paul was dragged outside the city and stoned. The attack was brutal. Those who carried it out believed he was dead. Leaving his battered body outside the city, They walked away convinced their work was finished. Yet God was not finished. Believers gathered around Paul. Then something remarkable happened. He got up. The missionary everyone thought was dead stood once more. The scars remained, the pain remained, but the mission continued. Most people would have abandoned the journey. Most would have returned home. Most would have viewed the attack as proof that the cost was too high. Paul did the opposite. He continued preaching. He continued traveling. He continued strengthening believers. Again and again, he reminded them that following Christ would not be easy. Trials would come. Opposition would come. Suffering would come. But the gospel was worth it. As the first missionary journey drew to a close, Paul and Barnabas revisited many of the cities where churches had been established. They encouraged believers. They appointed leaders. They helped create foundations that would endure long after they departed. Then they returned to Antioch, the city where the mission had begun. The report they brought was astonishing. God had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. The gospel was spreading far beyond anything many believers had imagined. The church was no longer a small movement centered in Jerusalem. It was becoming a worldwide mission, and Paul stood at the center of it. Yet the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The roads would become longer. The dangers would become greater. The opposition would become fiercer. But so would the opportunities. The former persecutor had become a missionary, and his journey across the Roman world was only beginning. The man who once hunted the followers of Jesus was now carrying the gospel to the nations. City after city, lives would be transformed. Churches would be planted. Empires would hear the name of Christ. But the road ahead would demand a price few could endure. Imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks, trials before kings. Yet through every hardship, Paul's faith would remain unshaken. His greatest journey was still to come. The rise of the Apostle Paul had only just begun. What part of Paul's journey spoke to you the most? Was it his courage, his faith, or his unwavering commitment to God's calling? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy cinematic biblical documentaries like this, subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the people, places, and history that shaped the Bible.